This is note 0.1 for Algebra 2. Make sure you have your packets out and ready and follow along with me while I go through these notes. Take your notes in your packet. We're going to start out with a review question, and this simply is asking us to distribute. So hopefully we remember how to distribute. We have 3a times 2a. When you distribute, you are multiplying. So 3 times 2 is 6. And we add our exponents. So those both have imaginary ones. So 1 plus 1 is 2. So that's 6a squared. And then 3a to the first times 1 is 3a. So our answer is 6a squared plus 3a. What we are doing today is learning, or relearning, because this should be a review from Algebra 1, we are relearning how to factor out a GCF. Once you have identified a GCF, you can factor it out. Factoring is the exact opposite of distributing. So exactly what we just did, we are now learning how to do it backwards. So if distributing is multiplying, like we just did, that means that factoring must be dividing because they're opposites. So basically what we're trying to do is work our way backwards. So in the review question, I started with something and ended up distributing or multiplying and got an answer. Well, in order to do that backwards, we would start with this answer, and then instead of multiplying, we're going to have to divide by something to end up with this as the question. So that's why for number 1, we're starting with that same 6a squared plus 3a. Our goal is to get an answer of 3a times 2a plus 1, because that's what we started with in the review question. So in order to factor out a GCF, we need to find the GCF. So we're going to fill in these steps down here. So step 1 is to identify the GCF. So a GCF is the greatest common factor. So we need the biggest number that goes into all of your terms, as well as the smallest exponent. So I have 6a squared plus 3a. Well, the biggest number that goes into 6 and 3 is a 3. And then since these both have the letter, that means my GCF will also have that same letter, but I just pick the smallest exponent. So this has an exponent of 2, and this term has an exponent of an imaginary 1. So that means my GCF is the imaginary 1, because you always take the smaller one. So next step is to write the GCF in front of parentheses. So I already wrote the GCF here, so that just means we need parentheses after that. Step 3 is to divide each term from the question by the GCF. So that's actually what I started writing before. That's why I put that 3 right here. We need to divide each of these terms by the GCF, which my GCF is 3a. So to the first. I'm dividing each of these by 3a to the first. And then it says, write your answers you get when dividing in the parentheses in order. And don't forget the plus or minus signs. So 6 divided by 3 is 2. A squared divided by a to the first. When you divide, you are subtracting exponents. So 2 minus 1 is 1. So this is 2a plus 3a divided by 3a. These are the exact same thing. Anything divided by itself is a 1. So I end up with 3a times 2a plus 1 as my answer, which is exactly what we started with in the review question. See, they match. So in the review question, we distributed, and in question number 1, we factored a GCF out. So distributing and factoring are opposites, therefore we have opposite answers. So we're just going to go through these next few questions. We have to identify the GCF and then factor it out. So the biggest number that goes into 10 and 30 is 10. And I pick my smallest exponent, so that's d to the third. So I'm going to divide both of these by 10d to the third. 10 divided by 10 is 1. D to the fourth divided by d to the third is d to the first, plus 30 divided by 10 is 3, and d to the third divided by d to the third, since they match, they cancel out. Technically, that equals 1, but since I already have a 3 here, it would be 3 times 1 then, and 3 times 1 is just 3. So if you already have a number written down, you can just cross off the matching variables and just call it a day. That's our answer. Now, number 3, we have 3 different terms here. We need to find the biggest number that goes into all 3 terms. My suggestion for you is to start with the smallest coefficient. Remember, a coefficient is the number attached to a variable. So we're going to start with the smallest coefficient, and we're going to see if that can go into our other coefficients. So my smallest coefficient in this example is 12. So what we're going to do is see if we can divide 42 by 12 and see if we can divide 18 by 12. So I'm going to switch over to my calculator, and we have 42 divided by 12, which that gives us 3.5. So since that gives us a decimal, that means that 12 is not the correct GCF. So we have to take our 12 and break it down. Let's figure out the factors of 12. So we have 1 and 12, that equal 12. 2 and 6 equal 12, 2 times 6, and 3 times 4 equal 12. So those are the factors of 12. We just tried 12 and it didn't work. It did not go into 42. So that means 12 is not our GCF. So what we're going to do is work our way down. So next up is 6, and then it would be 4, 3, 2, and 1. So we go biggest to smallest. So we're going to try 6 next. I'm going to try dividing 42 by 6, and then if that works, I'm going to try dividing 18 by 6. If those are both divided by 6, that means that 6 is our GCF. So let's try the 42 divided by 6. That works. We get 7. And now let's try the 18 divided by 6. That also works. We get 3. So both of our answers were whole numbers, which means that 6 is our winner. That is the number that is in our GCF. Next up, I need to pick my variables that go into the GCF, and we are picking the smallest exponent. So we've got 4, 3, or 2. So 2 is the smallest exponent, so that means my GCF is 6d squared. So I will divide these all by 6d squared. And now we actually do the division. So 12 divided by 6 is 2. And d to the fourth divided by d squared, we subtract exponents when we're dividing. So 4 minus 2 is 2. Then I bring down the plus sign. 42 divided by 6 is 7. And d to the third divided by d squared, 3 minus 2, that's 1. So you could put just d, or you could put d to the imaginary first power. And then bring down the minus sign. 18 divided by 6 is 3. And same thing like the last question, d squareds, they're the exact same match, so those cancel. And since we already have a 3 here, we don't have to put the 1 for the placeholder. So that's our answer. So now we are going to the next page. We've got 6 questions here. Number 4, 16d to the fourth plus 16d. The biggest number that goes into 16 and 16 is 16. Since these are the exact same number, that is your GCF. Next up, the letters. We've got d to the fourth and d to the imaginary first. We're picking the smaller exponent for the GCF, so that would be d to the imaginary first. So I'm going to divide by 16d to the first. Put my answer in parentheses. 16 divided by 16 is 1. And d to the fourth divided by d to the first, you subtract exponents, so 4 minus 1 is 3. Plus 16 divided by 16 is 1 again, and actually d to the first and d to the first, these are the exact same thing, so they technically both can cancel each other out, but you do need a 1 there. If the whole term cancels out, you need the 1 as a placeholder. So we have 16d times 1d to the third plus 1. I will highlight in red which ones could be left out. So both of those ones that I just highlighted in red are imaginary. They do not need to be there. This one does need to be there because there's nothing attached to it. So that one has to be there. But both of the red ones that I highlighted, since there's stuff attached to them, neither of those actually need to be there. All right, number 5. I have 6d to the 5th plus 10d cubed minus 21d squared. So pick your smallest number and see if you can divide by that. So my smallest number here is the 6. So I'm going to see if I can divide 10 by 6 and 21 by 6. 10 divided by 6 gives you a decimal. So 6 is not your GCF. So what we're going to do is break down 6 and see what other numbers we can use. So 6, you can get to 6 by doing 1 times 6 or 2 times 3. We just saw that 6 doesn't work because 6 does not go into 10. So let's try 3. Does 3 go into 10? Well, hopefully you already know that the answer is no. 3 does not go into 10, but we can prove it by doing 10 divided by 3 and see we get a decimal. So 3 is also not the GCF. So next up is 2. Well, I know I can divide 10 by 2, but 21 is not an even number, so I can't divide 21 by 2. So that's not going to work either, which means our GCF is actually just a 1. Now, you don't really technically need to put the 1 because dividing by 1 does nothing. So now let's just look at our variables because we still have to find the smallest exponent. So I've got 5, 3, and 2. 2 is our smallest exponent, so that makes our GCF d squared, or 1d squared if you want the 1 there. So now I'll divide. 6 divided by 1 is 6, and d to the 5th divided by d squared is d to the 3rd, because we subtract exponents when dividing. Bring down the plus. 10 divided by 1 is 10, and d to the 3rd divided by d squared is d to the 1st, or just d. And then minus 21 divided by 1 is 21, and the d squareds are the exact same thing, so those can go away. And there we have our answer. Number 6. All right, so our smallest coefficient is 4, so I'm going to try dividing 20 by 4 and 8 by 4. So I know 20 can be divided by 4 because that's 5. 5 times 4 is 20. And 8 can be divided by 4 as well. So that means that 4 does work. 4 is our GCF. And my smallest exponent is 3, so that's 4d cubed. So I'm going to divide these all by 4d cubed. 20 divided by 4 is 5. D to the 5th divided by d to the 3rd is d squared. Plus 4 divided by 4 is 1. D to the 4th divided by d to the 3rd is d to the 1st. Minus, because I'm bringing down this sign here, 8 divided by 4 is 2, and d to the 3rds cancel. And there you have your answer. Again, these, what I highlight in red, these ones are imaginary. They don't actually need to be there. Now, number 7, I've got 18 and 12. My smaller coefficient is the 12, but hopefully you're able to tell that you cannot divide 18 by 12. And we can just type it in really fast just to prove it. 18 divided by 12, you get a decimal, so that cannot be your GCF. So that means I need to take 12, and I want to list the factors of it. So you can get 12 by doing 1 times 12, 2 times 6, and 3 times 4. We just saw that 12 doesn't work. So next up is 6. I do know that I can divide 18 by 6 because I get 3. So that means that 6 is actually our GCF. So it's 6d because my smaller exponent, this is d to the 3rd, well this is d to the imaginary 1st. So that is the smaller. So I'm going to divide these by 6d to the 1st. 18 divided by 6 is 3. D to the 3rd divided by d to the 1st is d squared. plus 12 divided by 6 is 2, and the d to the first are the same, so those can go away. And that's your answer. Red 1, this that I highlighted in red, is optional. It does not need to be there. Okay, 2 more questions. Number 8 has 2 different letters. Your terms all have to have a letter in order for that letter to go into the GCF. So looking at our letters here, well, we know that 2 goes into 2 and 14. So we know that our GCF is going to have a 2. We have to make sure they both have the letters. So we have V and V. And those are the exact same, so we don't even have to pick which one to put into the GCF because they're the same, so it just automatically goes. And then they both have, this is m squared and this is m. So they both have the letter, which is good. So I just need to pick the one with the smaller exponent, which is the one without the exponent, which is an imaginary 1. So my GCF is 2vm, and you could put the imaginary 1s if you'd like, but you don't need them. So then I start dividing. 2 divided by 2 is 1. V divided by V, also 1, but we already have the 1 here, so we don't need it. We can just cross them out. M squared divided by m to the first, we subtract our exponents, so 2 minus 1 is a 1. So that's m to the first, or again, just m if you would like. Minus 14 divided by 2 is 7. The v's match, so those cancel, and actually the m's match, so those also cancel, so it's just 1m minus 7. You could also write this as just 2vm times m minus 7. You don't need any of those imaginary 1s. Because these guys, these are optional. You don't need these 1s. All right, number 9, which is our last question, but I'm actually going to do this 2 times because I want to show you what happens if they don't all have a variable. So now we've got 24, 116, and 168. So 24 is my smallest coefficient. So let's try dividing our other terms by 24. So we have 116. 116 divided by 24 gives us a decimal. So 24 is not the GCF, which means I have to take 24 and break it down. List the factors. So 1 times 24, 2 times 12, 3 times 8, and 4 times 6. Those are our factors of 24. We just saw that 24 doesn't work, so I'm going to cross that out. So next we're going to try 12. So I'm going to do 116 divided by 12 and then 168 divided by 12, and hopefully we don't get decimals. 116 divided by 12, I get a decimal again, so it's not 12, so let's try 8. 116 divided by 8, also a decimal, so it's not 8. Let's try 6. 116 divided by 6, also a decimal, so it's not 6. So next up is 4. 116 divided by 4. Okay, that works, but we have to make sure 168 can be divided by 4 as well. Okay, good. They both are divisible by 4, which means 4 is my GCF. So this is 4, and then I pick the smallest exponent. So I've got r cubed, r squared, and then just r to the imaginary first. So that is the smallest exponent. That is what goes into our GCF. So when I divide, 24 divided by 4 is, 24 divided by 4 is 6, and r cubed divided by r to the first, 3 minus 1 is 2, so that's 6r squared, plus 116 divided by 4 was 29, and r squared divided by r to the first is just r, and then 168 divided by 4, what was that? 42. So that's minus 42, and the r's cancel. So that is our answer. And the last thing I'm going to do with you is this exact same question, but we're going to pretend that the last r doesn't exist. So this is what would happen if that 168 didn't have an r. If it doesn't have an r, that means your GCF cannot have an r. So our GCF would just be 4. You would just divide these by 4. and I would get 6r cubed plus 29r squared minus 106, or sorry, minus 42. So that would be if the r was missing here. Your GCF cannot have a letter unless all of the terms have the letter. So be careful when you're doing your homework. I think it's number 3 on the homework. The one term doesn't have the variable, so you have to make sure your GCF does not get a variable either. All right, so now you can go to your packets and do homework 0.1, and you can upload a picture of your work to Google Classroom when you are done.